and welcome to the Conservation Efforts Database webinar. My name is Leif Wickman with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and this is the first in a series of 3 webinars provided for the Nevada Collaborative Conservation Network. These 3 webinars are intended to capture the content and conversation that took place during an in-person workshop held in Reno on April 18th, 2019. Before we get underway, I'd like to acknowledge Justin Welty with the USGS in Boise and Matt Heller with the Fish and Wildlife Service in Bozeman. They are 2 members of the Conservation Efforts Database team and help provide content for this webinar. So as we get underway, the goals for this workshop is to, again, provide kind of a high-level overview of what the CED is, what the CED can do, and how the CED may provide utility for you or your agency or organization. This is an outline of the 3 talks put together. Again, provide an overview and history of the Conservation Efforts Database, a background on the features and function, a purpose for why we're collecting the data and how that information is used. Again, features to the CED and updates we've provided from version 1 to now version 2.1. We'll then take a deeper dive into the threat-based structure and organization of the tool, talk about data collection, reporting, and then we'll close out the 3rd webinar or the 3rd video in the series talking about collaboration and interoperability. Again, as a reminder, for this first webinar, we'll be talking about these bullets highlighted in yellow. So what is the Conservation Efforts Database? It's a web-based geospatial database. It is established to collect information tied to the actions that are aimed to address, reduce, or remove threats impacting sagebrush habitat loss and degradation. Again, I'll say that again. We're collecting information on conservation actions and treatments that aim to address the driving threats impacting habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation in the sagebrush ecosystem. The CED is user-friendly and easy to use. Now, why do we have the CED? Well, the WAFLA-led Greater Sagegrass Conservation Strategy, completed in 2006, identified the need to monitor the implementation of conservation actions. Furthermore, it also called out a need to monitor the effectiveness of those conservation actions. Now, subsequent to that strategy, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did a species status assessment on greater sagegrass in 2010, resulting in a precluded but not warranted finding. In 2015, when the service started another status assessment for greater sage-grouse, it became apparent that we not only needed to know what conservation actions were taking place, but we needed a way to better assess the conservation benefit and effectiveness of said actions on addressing those threats driving habitat loss and degradation. We needed to know spatially where they were on the landscape, where they being implemented relative to those threats, as well as relative to the resource, to sagebrush habitat and sage-grouse populations. Sage-grouse themselves are not evenly distributed across the landscape and have a clump distribution, meaning that certain conservation actions cited in one area may provide a higher benefit than the same conservation action implemented somewhere else. In the process of developing the CED to meet those needs, we established a few primary tenets to drive development. The first is that it was easy to use. We wanted this to be as easy as any other website you might use. We also know that people are doing a lot of work tracking information in a bunch of different databases and existing systems. And so we wanted and want the CED to be able to integrate with those existing databases and decision support tools to reduce workload. We want the database and the data collected to be secure. We do that through a number of ways. Of course, we have any users must register for a profile before you can truly unlock all of the features and functions and gain access to all those features and functions that we provide. Secondarily, we have each of our partner agencies or organization establish an approving official. That approving official is the one who can determine who can enter and edit information in the CED on behalf of their agency or organization. View them as gatekeepers as you will. They're also in charge of doing quality control and oversight for any data entered in through their respective agency or organization. Third, we wanted the CED to be transparent. It's a public-facing site. There was a lot of attention on the Greater Sage-Grouse Status Assessment, and so we wanted to make sure that any information that we were collecting in the CED that was going to be used as part of that decision was going to be viewed by the public. The information that is entered in the CED becomes part of the public record and subject to FOIA. Additionally, the interactive map displays all spatial data entered and allows for some querying and other features and functions. Again, the primary functions of the CED, not our goals, but the function is data entry and collection, as well as reporting. So we'll touch here on what information is collected, and then we'll do a brief overview of the reporting capabilities and how this information is used. So what information does the CED collect? We collect information in three kind of categories, and I'll touch on those categories in a minute. But you'll see here the word spatial. You'll also see semi-spatial and non-spatial, and I'll touch on that here. But what those three categories mean is whether or not we're asking data providers to give us spatially explicit information about the treatment implemented. Shapefiles, treatment boundaries. That's what we're talking about when we say spatial information here. For semi-spatial, which I'll provide some examples of in a minute, we're not asking for that spatially explicit treatment boundary, but rather a geographic area of interest. In the past, we have used counties. In the future, we'll be moving to a unit known as a sagebrush reporting unit. And I'll talk about those sagebrush reporting units and their developments in our second webinar. And then we collect non-spatial information. These are typically associated with plans and strategies, other documents that help guide conservation actions and strategies, but don't necessarily provide a boots on the ground treatment. So back to that first category, we're collecting spatial information. That's spatially explicit information on actions addressing agriculture conversion, oil and gas development, conifer expansion, wildfire, invasive annual grasses and weeds, as well as riparian and wet meadow restoration. Now, the actions that would address those are predominantly conservation easements and land acquisitions, things like conifer removals, conifer cuts, house fire restoration or potentially fuels management projects or treatments on the front end, as well as invasive annual grass treatments. You can all picture cheatgrass treatments, spraying, targeted grazing, things of that nature. Now, in that second category of information where we're asking for general, semi-spatial information or non-spatial information, again, those are tied to things including but not limited to state conservation strategies, improved grazing practices, federal land use plans. And if you're looking for a complete list of the activities and sub-activities that we collect information on, they can be found in the CED's user manual in Table 1 and Table 2. And that user manual is under the Help tab on the conservationefforts.org website. So providing a high-level overview of the data collection, there are 4 primary components to that data collection. So the first would be basic project information. Now you'll hear me use the word project. When we say project, we mean it in a general sense. To be very clear, we're actually looking for treatment level information. And for those of you who are maybe wondering what the difference is, certain agencies use a hierarchy where they'll have a project boundary, a project area, which is relatively large, and then they're conducting a number of various treatments within that project boundary. Again, the Conservation Efforts database is wanting that treatment level information, not the project level. So we're asking for a treatment name and the implementation status. And we'll go into more detail on some of these, or I may reference you back to some other training webinars that we have recorded and also posted under the Help tab of the CED website. But implementation status is essentially one of 2 things. It's either ongoing, it's in progress, or it's been completed. We also have activities and sub-activities. Our activities are higher level. They're things like sagebrush protection, sagebrush restoration, regulatory mechanisms, and the sub-activities are more specific details nested within. So under sagebrush protection, a sub-activity is a conservation easement or a land acquisition. Under the activity of sagebrush restoration, the sub-activities include cheatgrass treatments, plantings, riparian restoration. The second component of the data collection is location. Again, if it's spatially explicit, the CED has a system in place where the user provides us with a shapefile, and then the CED automatically takes that shapefile and runs an intersect with a number of underlying layers so that we know which state, which management zone, which sagegrass population that treatment falls within. Third component is implementation and effectiveness information. This is related to the conservation action or a suite of action and is essential to help evaluate how the effort or action contributes to reducing or ameliorating a potential threat or impact to sagebrush habitat loss. Lastly are some other basic activity information. The date when the treatment occurred, acres. When we say acres, we actually collect it in 2 ways. Because for certain sub-activities, we're collecting that spatially explicit information, we calculate the acreage contained within that shapefile, that polygon. However, sometimes there's slight errors or slivers, and the user may want to define a corrected acreage. Of course, if those 2 figures are significantly different, typically less or typically more than 10% off, the CED does provide a warning and asks the user to either rectify the spatial information provided or their user provided acres. Again, kind of showing you some of this information. We've got the basic project information here, as you can see. And if you'll see a red star, of course, those fields are required. Some of this information is tied to the user's profile. Again, that location information, once the shapefile or spatial information is uploaded, you'll see that the intersecting layers underneath are identified. Again, that implementation and effectiveness information is thus, is it in progress or completed? And then these effectiveness options will vary dependent on the sub-activity. Now here we put in a humorous example of rationale, explain why the activity was deemed effective. It worked really well. That would actually be an inadequate response. We're looking for things that are founded in peer-reviewed literature or that have post-treatment monitoring information that helps tell us how and why a particular treatment is effective. Lastly, some of that basic activity information again. You'll see that we have some questions whether or not the effort was related to a post-fire restoration, and if seeding or planting is a type of the treatment, whether it was native, non-native, or mixed seeding or plants used. Now there's two methods for data entry. The first is a single record entry. That's where you're actually sitting down in front of the computer, you need an internet connection, and you're going to enter one record, one step at a time. We kind of have a rule of thumb that if your organization or agency has less than 100 records to enter, single record entry is probably the most efficient for you. You're less likely to make errors, it's easier to review, but again, it's not practical if you have a large amount of information. If you have more than 100 records to enter, then we have a process known as the batch upload, which is a geodatabase template that allows you to migrate and transfer information from existing databases into the geodatabase, which then we upload into the system. You then sit down with the user interface and make sure that all your required fields have been populated. If you want to make any changes at that point, you can. And then they're submitted for review to those aforementioned approving officials, those gatekeepers. So at that stage, you'll enter a record and it kind of sits in a holding room and doesn't become part of the actual database or the public record until the approving official has kind of signed off on it. Now again, I touched on some of the tenets were security and transparency, but because we want this information to be accurate, we do a couple things to promote and ensure that high quality of data. So we have multiple levels of authorized users. You can be authorized to simply submit information without approving it. Again, agency or organization identifies who their approving official is. You can have more than one approving official per agency. And again, that approving official or those officials are responsible for making sure the data is accurate. Once approved, the data goes into the database. If it has a spatial component to it, it'll be displayed on our interactive map, and it becomes part of the record in a read-only format. Now, I just mentioned that interactive map, and once we get to the third webinar, we'll do a deeper dive into the interactive map and some of its features. But we have an interactive map, which is a data viewer that you can use to filter or query information that's in the CED. It also has a number of background layers, spatial layers that we run background intersects with, and you have the ability to turn on and off and see, um, in relation to certain habitat designations like PAC or core, or perhaps information on resilience and resistance from the recently released science framework documents. Um, the interactive map also provides you with a quick summary based on your selected filters. And we've actually improved functionality now to have a downloadable PDF report should you want to take information from the CED and insert it into a report. And there will be some differences on how we report on conservation actions on public lands versus private lands, and we'll touch on that more in the second webinar. Now, in addition to the interactive map, the CED does have a feature that can generate tabular reports. As of right now, because we're in the middle of a data collection period and we haven't done a full QA/QC on the data set, we've temporarily disabled that tabular query feature, but it will be available again once we have the data set cleaned. That tabular query provides you with all of the fields that are viewable to the public, and you can sort and manipulate the spreadsheet in a way that you need. So again, just some quick high-level overviews of what we can do on the interactive map. Again, here's a screenshot of the interactive map. You'll see the polygons in the background representing the data that we've already collected. Different colors represent different activity or sub-activity types. If you were to select any one polygon, this is the text box that pops up, giving you a very high-level overview of what the action is. So here you can see that we have land acquisition as the sub-activity under the activity of sagebrush protection. It's going to provide you with the number of acres. And if you're saying, well, hey, this doesn't really provide me with a lot of information, I'd like more information on this particular treatment, we provide contact information for the data provider. Additionally, being we have over 5,000 records in the CED, if you know of a treatment or a project that you're searching for by name, we have an autocomplete text box, which you'll see kind of on the left side of the image there. And just like a Google search, it'll pop up and show you the available options. Again, that was showing you the filter, the query tools. This is showing you our legend and layer options. Again, what you're seeing on the screen is a greater sagegrass population index combined with the resilience and resistance information. That's the Doherty et al. Work that is contained in the Science Framework Part 1. That's the Chambers et al. 2017 citation. You'll also notice that when you conduct a particular query or filter, that this table appeared at the bottom of the image. And that is a sortable table in which you can manipulate the various column headings to search for a particular subset of the information you're filtering. Again, these are customizable queries with a matching data table view. That data table is what I just mentioned. So again, depending on if you were to select a conifer removal in the state of Wyoming, it's going to provide you with all of the conifer removals that were conducted, as well as the tabular results at the bottom. Furthermore, you can be provided with just a quick summary. And so again, if you knew the particular office that entered that information, you can change your base layer maps to take a look at it, and you'll see that quick summary down in the lower left-hand corner indicates that there was one spatial project entered, 2 non-spatial projects, and 1 plan. So the only thing you can see on the map is actually the 1 spatial record, even though the 3, the spatial and non-spatial projects, are displayed in the tabular view below. And lastly, we have what's called a full summary report. So this actually opens up a new browser window and provides you with a total summary of the conservation action polygons that you have filtered or queried for, run against a number of filters that we have running in the background, from the implementing party to the activity type to state, management zone, etc. So how is the CED used, and how is the information the CED collects used by the Fish and Wildlife Service and their partners? So as I alluded to earlier, the information has been and can be used to support status assessments. Again, we're using it to track implementation of those conservation actions. The CED also, through our interactive map, has the ability to provide context for project planning or treatment planning. Or on the flip side, if development were to occur, but you know there's been significant conservation investment, you may want to steer clear of those areas. And lastly, we're starting to work on recovery tracking, where through recovery plan or implementation strategy, where actions have been identified that are necessary to recover a particular species, we can track those targets, collect the information on the conservation actions implemented, so all stakeholders can monitor progress towards that recovery. Who can use and who can access the CED and the data collected? So the CED is open to the public. It's a public-facing website, and anyone is able to register. Of course, if you are a new agency or organization, we ask that you provide us with the information for your agency or organization so we can identify an approving official. Once you're registered, again, you can do those customized queries, but the data entered is not readily available for download. It's not readily available for download whether you're a registered user or not. And we do have a process in place that have been run through our stakeholder and federal and state partners to access CED data. We'll touch on that process more in depth when we get to the third webinar. Where can you find the CED? You can find it at conservationefforts.org, or if you Google CED FWS, should be the first hit. So I mentioned we started this back to support the 2015 Greater Sage-Grouse Status Review. But since then, we've gone to our partners, we've gone to our federal agency partners, state partners, and we've solicited input. What worked? What didn't work? What features need to be improved? What features did we not have that would provide more utility for our partners? So over the last few years, we've continued to make adjustments, make improvements, add new features, trying to make the CED not only easier to use, but more beneficial for our partners. Some of the significant changes we made through that feedback process is initially the CED was set up to track conservation actions aimed at benefiting sage-grouse. We're shifting away from that, expanding our focus from sage-grouse specific out to the sagebrush biome as a whole. There's over 350 species that depend on the sagebrush ecosystem in one way, shape, or form. And so we'd like to talk to the conservation actions that have benefited all those species or some of those species. We've also significantly improved our ability to integrate with existing decision support tools and databases. We now have a process in place in which we can create web service features so that spatial data shown on the CED can be displayed on other decision support tools. However, that data is never held by those other tools or databases. It cannot be manipulated by those other tools or databases. And if further information is needed, points the user back to the CED, which will point the requesting party back to the original data provider. We initially didn't have the ability to generate those summaries and reports that I showed you, but we do now. And furthermore, we're able now to provide a really comprehensive snapshot of all of the efforts being implemented, which can provide insight for where things are working, perhaps where things are not, and where conservation investments can be made, again, at a coarse scale. This is not a tool designed to provide insight on site level planning. In regards to data collection, in CED version 1, we were asking for spatially explicit information on any sub-activity in which we collected information on. However, we found out that that was not only more labor intensive for our partners, but in all honesty, we don't have a known biological relationship between some of those conservation actions and the response that we would see either in sagebrush habitat quantity, quality, or things like sage-grouse demographics. It's not to say that those actions aren't useful or don't provide conservation benefit. It's just that we in the CED don't have a way to easily quantify what that benefit is. So we're only asking for spatially explicit information on a subset of the sub-activities, those in which I highlighted earlier in this talk. In the process in adjusting the way in which we collect information on effectiveness, we also looked and through our stakeholder working group developed some standardized treatment objectives, methodology, and effectiveness statements based on those objectives and methodologies. All of these statements were supported by peer-reviewed literature, and it's to help not only us in our evaluation, but help our data providers with some consistency in which the data that they're reporting. And so this is concluding the first, again, of 3 webinars. In our next webinar, we'll talk more about the threat-based structure of the CED, as well as we'll get into more of the details for data collection.